Hello, I'm Michael Lakey. This is video 4 in the series of videos that we're doing for the New Testament Studies module for Oxford Diocese. And in the first half of this term, we're looking at the Gospel of John. In the second half of this term, we're looking at the Corinthian correspondence. This week, in our consideration of the Gospel of John, that we're going to be looking at one motif in particular. We're looking at the motif of signs. And in order to understand what John is saying about the deeds of Jesus and what they mean by means of the term sign, it's important to have a sense of the repertoire of terms that are available to him. As we've said elsewhere, sometimes with the Bible, it's not just what's said, it's what's said against the range of possibilities of things that could have been said. And so, we're going to be looking a little bit at that this week. To help you with your reflection on this, I've included two pieces of reading. The first piece of reading is an excellent excursus in the commentary by Rudolf Schnackenberg on the Gospel of John, on signs in John. Now, Schnackenberg is an absolutely superb commentator. He's probably, I think, the best of the mid to late 20th century commentators. And his work on John's Gospel is magisterial. It's a 3-volume commentary. And it is vast, but it is rich. And I've included this small excerpt as reading on the Moodle page. Then the second piece of reading that I've included for you is a piece of reading by Mundell, Hoffus and Brown in the New International Dictionary of New Testament Theology. And it's an article entitled Miracles. And in that article, Mundell tackles one piece of the miracle terminology of the ancient Greek language. Hoffus tackles another, and Brown tackles the third. And it's a good article. Please read it. It will give you useful context for understanding what's going on when John describes Jesus' miracles as signs. Now, just by way of a recap, I'm going to take us back to the structure of the Gospel of John that we did in week 1. So here on the screen is a John's narrative structure. So we've got the prologue. We've got what some scholars call the Book of Signs. Introductory events, chapter 2, revelation through a sign. Chapter 4, a second miracle. Chapter 5, the healing of a lame man. Chapter 6, the feeding of the crowds. Chapter 6, Jesus walks on water. Chapter 9, Jesus heals a man born blind. Chapter 11, Jesus raises the dead, and there's 7 signs there. There's the water into wine in chapter 2. There's the second miracle in Galilee. There's the lame man, the crowds, the walking on water, the man born blind, and the raising of Lazarus. And there's some debate about whether there's 7 signs or whether there's 8 signs, because of course the great sign at the end of John's Gospel is that Jesus is resurrected. There's a question there. And then from chapter 13 on, the standard division amongst some scholars is that the Passion narrative begins, and this is called the Book of Glory. So signs and glory. Although it's interesting, in chapter 2, the glory is not a theme which is devoid of reference in the Book of Signs. Chapter 2, the water into wine, Jesus revealed his glory and his disciples put their trust in him. Lots of references to glory. But glory is a very distinctive theme. The Son of Man, Jesus, enters into his glory through crucifixion and resurrection. He returns to his Father, to the glory that he had before all things. And then at the end of the Passion and Resurrection narratives, we've got the epilogue. So if we scoot forward just to have a quick look at the signs, there's a list of the signs: water into wine, the official son, healing the paralytic, feeding the multitude, walking on water, healing the man born blind, and raising Lazarus. It's worth noting that there are very few minor miracles in John. Now, this isn't to say that there aren't things that are called signs. It's just that if we compare John with Mark, say, in the Gospel of Mark, there are lots of relatively minor healings. There are lots of relatively minor exorcisms. And then there are several what form critics called nature miracles. And in the nature miracles, Jesus does things that only a God could do. And specifically in the Bible stories, only the God of Israel would do. The walking on the water, the multiplication of the loaves and things like that. Whereas John whittles down the list, the tradition of miracles, the list of miracle stories that were undoubtedly circulating in the early church, whittles them down in the Gospel to 7, plus the resurrection, but points out in John chapter 20 that he did many other signs in the presence of his disciples which aren't written here. And so John very clearly is signalling that the signs are a selected set of miracle events. And we might ask, what's the reason for the selection? What's the theology at work in the selection? I think it's fair for us to say that for John, signs aren't acts that testify only to the power wielded by Jesus. And this is where some conception of the terminological distinctions between different classes of irregular act is useful. And we'll look at some Greek in a moment. But it's fair to say that signs aren't merely acts that testify to Jesus' power. Think about it this way. A deed of power doesn't necessarily have to say anything beyond the person who does it has the power to do it. A deed of power doesn't necessarily have to have a meaning beyond, look at how powerful this person is. Is that what is going on with the signs? Does Jesus turn the water into wine at the wedding at Canaa simply because turning water into wine is a remarkable act? That's a really interesting one. I don't think so. There are clues in the text, the juxtaposition of the water, which was water for purification, according to Jewish worship, and the wine, which is the wine of the celebration of the wedding feast of the Lamb, telescoped forward in history to this particular wedding at Canaa. It's not obvious that there's no meaning attached to the wine, and therefore the Jesus isn't being described when we talk about the signs as a simple wonder worker, somebody who walks around doing unexpected and remarkable things. It's also worth bearing in mind, signs aren't acts that symbolize some reality outside or behind the person of Jesus. What do we mean by that? Well, the early 20th century, late 19th century, early 20th century German theologian Adolf von Harnack, when he was talking about the Gospel of Mark, said, "Isn't it interesting how Jesus goes from being the proclaimer to being the proclaimed?" And we'll have a quick look at that. So I'm going to move us forward to, here we are, Mark chapter 1, verse 14. "After John was arrested, Jesus came to Galilee, proclaiming the good news of God, and saying, 'The time is fulfilled and the kingdom of God has come near. Repent and believe in the good news.'" Here Jesus is the proclaimer of the kingdom. He's the proclaimer of the kingdom. By the time we get to the end of Mark, let's go to the crucifixion of Jesus, and here's the death of Jesus. Mark 15:39. "Now, when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, 'Truly, this man was God's son.'" And then if we go to the resurrection of Jesus, missing the longer and shorter ending, what the women are told to proclaim is, "Go and tell his disciples that he's going ahead of you to Galilee, and there you will see him." And the proclamation is, "You were looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here." And so what you've got there, von Harnack was correct. There's a move in the Gospel of Mark from Jesus as proclaimer of the kingdom, proclaiming something besides himself, to Jesus as the one who is proclaimed. Of course, that's an oversimplification, and I think I'm not entirely in sympathy with von Harnack's reading here, but it's an interesting literary point, even if we would argue that the whole of the Gospel is written from the perspective of Easter faith, and the whole of the Gospel is written from the perspective of Jesus as the centre of the Easter faith, and therefore even the beginning of the Gospel is written with the knowledge that we're going to end in Mark 16. Even if we credit all of that, it's still an interesting literary move to have Jesus arrive as proclaimer and end up as proclaimed. In the Gospel of John, I'm just going to move us back to the handout. In the Gospel of John, the signs are instrumental to indicating that there is no reality outside or behind the person of Jesus that is proclaimed as the message. Jesus is the message as well as the messenger. There's no gradual escalation of miracles in John. Because, of course, if in Mark you're a gospel that's going somewhere, there's a trajectory, there's a story, the revelation gets deeper, and there's this move from coming to believe in Jesus as the Messiah to learning exactly how Jesus is discontinuous as well as continuous with messianic expectations. In other words, how he fulfills our expectations, but also modifies them. Specifically in the area of suffering. If there's no trajectory like that in John's Gospel, and I think John's Gospel reads flatter at the level of revelation theology than the Synoptic Gospels, then of course there's no need for a gradual escalation of miracles where Jesus begins as a kind of itinerant teacher and healer and wonder worker and ends up doing things that only the God of Israel can do, like walking on water. So I don't think the signs are associated with anything other than the revelation of Jesus. And so one of the ways in which we might describe the signs is that they are manifestations in action of the interior nature of Jesus. They're signs of the presence of the Logos, the Word incarnate. They're Christophanies. No one has ever seen God, but God, the one and only, has made him known. They're disclosures of the truth of his identity. He revealed his glory and his disciples put their trust in him. As such, the signs are the building blocks of John's Christology, and they're also related conceptually to the blocks of teaching that are dispersed through John. Think about the feeding of the 5,000, I am the bread of life. The raising of Lazarus, I am the resurrection. So the signs are crucial building blocks of John's Christology. It's worth talking briefly about the signs source, a little bit of revision. Lots of scholars have proposed that the Gospel of John comprises of several pre-Gospel traditions that have been redacted to produce a final form of the text. And the most common proposal has been that the central section of the Gospel originally circulated as a book of signs, a list of deeds of Jesus. Some people, Fortner, for instance, argue that it was a primitive Gospel. For Bultmann, there are three independent sources. There's a signs source, a discourse source, and a passion narrative. I agree with Martin that the signs are foundational for the rest of the Gospel, if by foundational that we mean that they are key to the Gospel. But I don't think they're key in any deeper sense than the prologue, which probably post-dates the signs. All good writers write their introductions last. It's not obvious that the prologue is less important than the signs. But they are foundational. They're foundational. They're probably, if these scholars are right, the kernel of John's Gospel onto which the Passion narrative and the other materials was added. And in that sense, we might think about the signs as being basic to John's theology of revelation. Jesus is, in John, what he does. And so we're talking here about signs as not signifying Jesus' power, not even signifying his presence, and we'll talk about that in a moment, but rather revealing his presence. What's the difference between signifying presence and revealing presence? Well, my shadow signifies my presence, but you don't know who it is until you see my face. Yeah, that's the difference. That's the difference. You know, it's quite possible for a sign to signify something without it being the manifestation of the presence of that thing. You know, I look outside and I see, I'm just looking outside now and I see that it's rained during the night. My car's wet, the ground is still a little bit damp. That's a natural sign. That's a sign that rain has been there. It isn't the rain. And that's the difference. That's the difference. There's a difference between signifying that something is here or has been here and being the manifestation of that thing. And so I think when we're talking about John and signs, we're talking about something which is quite specific. We're talking about something which is quite specific. The signs in John aren't simply signs of Jesus' power. They're not simply signs that Jesus is bringing the kingdom. They're not simply signs that Jesus is the fulfillment of the Old Testament. They're not even signs that Jesus is the fulfillment, but also the novel reformulation of the Old Testament imagery. They're ultimate. They're not even signs that in Jesus God has come close to his people. Rather, for John, they are revelations of the glory of Jesus. They somehow mediate something of the truth of who he is. Manifestations of his presence, rather than signs of the effects of his presence. And that's why the signs and the discourse material go together often in John quite well, because the discourse material elaborates on the theophany that is taking place in the sign. And so we'll have a look at that in a moment. First, we're going to backtrack and do a little bit of the lexical work and just have a look at, let's see, where am I at? So I've got here, this is a dictionary called a Greek-English Dictionary of the New Testament and Other Early Christian Literature. Its abbreviation is BDAG, which stands for its authors, Bauer, Danker, Arndt and Gingrich. And it's a kind of industry standard lexicon for New Testament and early Christian literature. And here, this word here, thaumazo, is the Greek verb which is most often used to talk about reactions to Jesus' deeds. Jesus did something and the crowd, they engaged in thaumazo. And what it refers to is it refers to the psychological effects of seeing something astonishing. And the astonishment is context neutral. You can be horrified, you can be overjoyed, you can be delighted, you can be awestruck. The deed itself can be good or bad. God promises to do things, terrifying things, which will make you wonder. In some of the prophets, in the Septuagint translation. Similarly, when Jesus does a healing, the crowd marvel. And so, the psychological effects, and the term thauma, which is the noun in response to which you engage in thaumazo, is the word for a wonder. And so basically what we're talking about is a surprising and remarkable event, a wonder, a marvel, something which is astonishing, something which is beyond the ordinary. Or as Bart Simpson says, something which is transmundane. I think it was Bart Simpson. Anyway, it's a wonder. Now, what's the character of a wonder? Well, a wonder, the point of the thing that you are pointing to in a deed, when you describe it as a thauma, is that it's outside of the natural, it's outside of the naturally expected set of events. It's a marvel. So you're pointing to its unlikelihood. You're pointing to the fact that whoever does it is extraordinary. You're pointing to possibly to the fact that whoever does it is powerful. There's an expression, a word called a thaumaturge, which is a word that is used to describe somebody who works wonders. The whole point of a thaumaturge is that they're powerful. And the point of thauma is that you're referring primarily to the power to do the event and the surprise in the people who see the event. You're not referring to some inner meaning in the event. Again, you can use thaumazo to describe wondering or respect of persons, wondering being amazed. And that's thauma. Let's have a look at teras. Teras. Now, teras is the word that's often translated marvel. But it can also, as we can see, teras or teratos or terata, it astounds because of some connection with transcendence. What the philosopher Rudolf Otto would have described as the numinous. So a teras is something that produces the sort of psychological effect that a marvel, a thauma produces, but it has some sort of transcendent association, either because it's connected with the uncanny, or because it is seen as a portent or an omen. And here there is a connection somehow of meaning with the deed. So a teras, it signifies connection with the gods somehow. It also signifies that something is about to happen or something might happen. So there's here we've got terata pola eginonto, which the commentator here in the article says it foretells the destructive effects of Sulla's campaign in Italy. So there's a terrifying portent that causes that causes those who see it retrospectively to see that the gods were telling us something dreadful was about to happen. There are portents in heaven. So portents in the stars, portents in the weather. This is a description of an act or event that is powerful and signals that something is coming. But there isn't necessarily a connection between the character of the act and either the character of the divinity or the character of the event that's coming. There's although the Septuagint describes the rainbow in the sky as a covenant, a sign, a semeion, that signals the covenant with God, that he will never destroy the world by flood again. It isn't clear to me, for instance, that the rainbow has the meaning covenant. The connection between the rainbow and the covenant is all there in God saying, I'm going to put this here as a sign of my covenant. But the connection between the rainbow and the covenant is basically arbitrary. At least it seems so to me. I'm not an Old Testament scholar, so undoubtedly someone will correct me. But there's a similar sort of thing going on with a terrace. A terrace, if it is a portent, it isn't obvious that there's any meaning in the act besides the fact that something terrible or something wonderful is coming. Compare that with sign. When we use the term sign wasn't originally, it's a semiotic term. That's where we get the term semiotics, semeion, semiotic, the study of signs. And when we talk about signs, it isn't obvious that signs is terminology that originated in describing the remarkable. Rather, it's signs. The term sign is originally about meaning, and then it's applied to remarkable events, or rather used as a term to describe a category of remarkable events. So it can be a sign distinguishing how something is known. It can be an event that is an indication or confirmation of an intervention by transcendent powers, a miracle or a portent. Can you see how it overlaps with marvel? One example would be let me see if I can find one in the list. Here's a one. A sign worked by Satan or his agents to mislead God's people. And that crops up in Irenaeus, but it crops up repeatedly in Revelation 13:13, 16:14 and 19:20. Signs and marvels, wonders, terrata. And there the emphasis is primarily on the sign as an indication that you're dealing with a transcendent power. It can be a portent in the heavens. And that's as far as we get with this lexicon. But I want to draw our attention not to Mark but to John, and to have a look at a couple of signs in John just briefly. The first is the wedding at Canaa. I've already asked the question. When Jesus act is described here as a sign, is it a wonder, a simply extraordinary act that may be done by transcendent power? Is it a sign? Is it a marvel, an extraordinary act whose purpose is to indicate that it is being done by a transcendent power? Or is there some sort of communication, some sort of signification going on? And one of the ways in which we would work that out we would have a look. Well, firstly, Jesus is concerned to say that his hour hasn't yet come. The moment for his revelation hasn't yet come. The context: 6 stone jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to them, fill them with water, draw some out and take to the chief steward. And then everyone serves the good wine first and then the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk, but you've kept the good wine until now. And then the immediate juxtaposition of that with, this is the first of Jesus' signs in Canaa of Galilee. He revealed his glory and his disciples believed in him, seems to be suggesting that the revelation of the glory of Jesus in this particular sign, in some respects, needs to be seen within an overall framework in which the later wine, Jesus, is better. It's the good wine. And the contrast there is between Jesus and the Jewish rites of purification. But the context is given in a wedding. And Jesus being revealed as the Christ, this motif that there is in the prophets and in the apocalyptic literature of eating and drinking with the Messiah, and the language of wedding feast, which is repeatedly used in the New Testament, suggests that the event itself, though unintentional, his hour has not yet come, is nonetheless laden with significance. And so here we've got at least 3 frameworks of significance. There's the revelation of Jesus and his glory. There's the wedding in Canaa as a trope of the messianic wedding feast. There's the contrast between Jesus as the centre of the worshipping community in John and the Jewish rites of purification, and that contrast. And then there's the earlier and later contrast, where the good wine is served last. It would seem to me that this goes beyond any consideration of the deed simply being a marvellous happening. And it would seem also that it goes beyond any consideration of the deed being a simple designation of this is the kind of thing that only a God could do. Rather, what we've got are eschatological images alluded to in the narrative context. We've got eschatological contrast alluded to in the steward's discussion with the bridegroom. You've got an evocative contrast between Jesus as the bridegroom, well, and who is the bride? And then you've got a ritual contrast between the Jewish rites of purification and Jesus, who, as we'll find out repeatedly in John, is positioned as the new centre of worship. The new cult object, the new cult place. And then the theological significance of the signs as being, they didn't just reveal that he was glorious, they revealed his glory. And then the point of the sign, to elicit trust. His disciples believed in him. So in other words, this passage draws in, by means of the sign, multiple themes and concerns and considerations in John. And the key thing is that Jesus, the sign itself, doesn't reveal the identity of Jesus, it manifests Jesus in his singular identity. It doesn't talk about Jesus, it reveals Jesus. And so I think the model of John doing something different with signs than some of the other terminology, which could equally be used to describe these events. You know, a pagan or a Jew or an early Christian might come along and describe turning water into wine as a marvel or as a wonder. But when they do that, they're saying something about the function of the miracle, whether it has a revelatory aspect, whether its revelatory aspect is minimal, and describing it as a sign describes it as something which communicates something which is more dense. I hope that makes sense. So let's have a look at John chapter 11. This will be a brief consideration because we're on about 42 minutes and I'm about ready to go. So let's have a think. A certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany. His sisters sent a message, verse 3, Lord, he whom you love is ill. Verse 4, this is key. Jesus delays setting off. This illness does not lead to death, it's rather for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Now, that's a really interesting question. It's rather for God's glory in order that the Son of God might be glorified through it. What's the relationship between glorifying God and glorifying the Son of God? It's a real interesting question there. It seems to suggest that God is glorified when the Son of God is glorified through something, which seems at some level to suggest that what's about to happen is a marvel, a teras, something which is there to signal that the one who does it is transcendent, a divine figure. That would be the first thing. The second thing, he stays there knowing Lazarus is ill and then says to the disciples, let's go. So the disciples become obstacles. You would just try to stone. They just tried to stone you there, and you're heading off again. But this gives him an opportunity to talk about light and darkness, and to talk about how our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep. He's entered the realm of darkness, but I'm going there to wake him up. The challenge, the interesting thing here is that in the discourse, you've then got, in the discourse that frames the sign, you've got Jesus playing on themes which are introduced in the prologue about light and dark. He is the light of the world. Then verse 13, the disciples misunderstand. If he's fallen asleep, he will be all right. But Jesus was speaking about his death. And at that point, he tells them Lazarus is dead. And then you've got, again, a reference to what is about to happen as something that is the basis for belief. For your sake, I'm glad I was not there, so that you may believe. Meaning, you may believe when I do what I'm about to do. So let us go. The disciples, Thomas, still don't get it. Let us also go that we may die with him. So anyway, moving on. Lazarus has been in the tomb 4 days. At this point, the processes of death can be understood to be well advanced. Every culture has its own idea about death as a process. Some cultures you're out like a light. Some cultures it takes time. Our culture we focus on things like brain death. In the Old Testament, death in some materials in the Old Testament, death wasn't properly concluded until your bones were stored in the tomb. But anyway, 4 days means that it's now irrevocable. So Mary and Martha come out. Martha comes out, Mary stays at home. Martha has the interaction with Jesus. If you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died. Jesus says, your brother will rise again. Again, like all good disciples, Martha misunderstands. She understands, yet misunderstands. I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. She doesn't know what he's about to do. In precisely the way that the disciples a paragraph earlier still don't get it. But they don't get it from a point of belief. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. Everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, I believe you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world. She believes. She believes. There's a real interesting contrast here, which I think anticipates the post-resurrection discussion of Thomas. She believes. Who's the speaker at the last paragraph? Thomas, who was called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, let us also go that we may die with him. He doesn't quite believe what's going to happen. He doesn't understand it. Martha believes, though she doesn't understand. Thomas doesn't believe, though he doesn't understand. At any rate, there's no indication at this point that Martha is of the opinion that Jesus is going to do something remarkable. Anyway, reiteration of the charge. When Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, Lord, if you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died. Jesus was greatly disturbed, agitated. Where have you laid him? He said. And they're still, in verse 37, engaging, unanticipating of what's about to happen. Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? At this point, the sign occurs. Take away the stone. Did I not tell you that if you believed, you'd see the glory of God? Verse 40. So they took away the stone. And then the prayer, which seems superficial. Not superficial, superfluous. Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I've said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me. This is a really interesting question. What's about to happen is at once a marvel, a teras. It signals that the one who does it is sent from the transcendent. And yet, the discourse material signals at the very least that the resurrection of Lazarus and Jesus as I am the resurrection and the life, no one comes to the Father except through me, those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. The I am the resurrection and the life signals that we're going beyond Jesus, the sign revealing only that Jesus is sent by God. So there's a qualitative relationship between the act and the discourse and what both together say about Jesus. And that's what's going on in the sign. That this is the overflow of life and light. And that even where he is, Lazarus in Sheol, the place of the dead, that's still somewhere where the light that illuminates all people can shine. And so there's something about the life, death, light, dark, death, resurrection, which signals the quality of the presence of Jesus' life. It's not just he was sent by God, even though there's repeated references to him being sent by God. And John ties this together through a soteriological move. It's through believing that Jesus was sent by God that we come to have the inner quality of who Jesus is manifest to us. If that makes sense. If we believe that Jesus is sent by God, we see the glory of God, but the glory of God is uniquely manifest in Jesus. And it's a glory of God which is manifest in all of the signs, as I am the bread of life. I'm the one in whom light and life lives. I'm the light that illuminates all people. And so what you've got in the signs, I think, is ultimately in the gospel, in its final form, the signs have become moments at which the Christology of the prologue is manifested in action. And so they're never just about pointing to something. They're rich with Christological and theological content. They are enacted theophanies. Anyway, I think that's given us more than enough. So I'm going to take the camera off share and just say thank you for tuning in. I'll see you all on Wednesday. God bless.